Comics. Comics.
Welcome back to the second part of our Lethal Weapon 36th anniversary episode. In part one, we talked about Lethal Weapon 1 and 2, and if you haven't seen or heard that episode, I recommend going back and checking that out before you listen to or watch this episode. In this episode, we'll be talking about Lethal Weapon 3 and 4, and even what we could dig up on the upcoming Lethal Weapon 5. My understanding is that there's even a Lethal Weapon video game that my man Steve here is going to cover. But before we get started, does anyone want to get out? Sorry, I couldn't help it. Had to pull the cap quote there. But seriously, was there anything you wanted to say, Steve?
Always a great quote for any occasion. But yes, I do have a few things to say. Lethal Weapon 3 is where the tone starts shifting away from an action buddy cop series with some comedy elements and into a full-on action comedy. I think a lot of that is because Shane Black was more heavily involved with the first two films, and his vision for the series was darker and much grittier than the way Richard Donner wanted to go. I don't think the later films are bad by any stretch, but they're very different films, much less grounded in real-world policing and more into big action set pieces and funny one-liners. I think this shows with Riggs particularly, who starts off as nearly suicidal and becomes a much more comedic character by the end. But why don't we get into Lethal Weapon 3 and talk about where things ended up?
Sure thing. Lethal Weapon 3 came out in 1992, 3 years after Lethal Weapon 2. It was once again produced by Richard Donner and Joe Silver, and then they, of course, used Silver Pictures for a production company. It was written by Jeffrey Boehm and Robert Mark Kamen, and Steve will get into that in more detail in a minute. I'm actually curious why the screenplay credit for the film ended up the way it did, and I think Steve should be able to clear that up. But for now, let's talk about the cast a little bit. Besides Gibson and Glover, all of the Murtaugh family came back. Darlene Love played Trish Murtaugh, Tracy Wolf played Rhiann, Damon Hines played Nick, and Ebony Smith played Carrie. As he does in all the sequels, Joe Pesci plays Leo Getz again. Steve Cahan came back as Captain Murphy. Mary Ellen Trainor reprised her role as Dr. Stephanie Woods, although it should be noted that we don't actually get to know her whole name until Lethal Weapon 4. Rene Russo is also introduced as Internal Affairs Officer Lorna Cole. The villain of the show, Drac Travis, is played by Stuart Wilson, although Robert De Niro was considered for the role. But I think that covers the casting stuff. What can you tell us about that screen credit and the writing process, Steve?
Sure thing. So get this. The screenplay of Lethal Weapon 3 was credited to, quote, Jeffrey Boehm and Robert Michael Kamen. Unquote. The reason the screenplay was given this credit is that Boehm wrote two different drafts, one solo and then another co-written by Kamen. It sounds like complete Hollywood nonsense to me, but that's the way it goes, I guess.
I think that is nonsense as well. I mean, there is no need to list Boehm twice. I don't really care how it went down. I mean, that kind of the rewrites and all that kind of stuff happens all the time in Hollywood, and they don't write the credits like that normally. My guess is that Boehm probably asked for it out of ego, but seeing it on the screen, it doesn't look good or read well. But that rant aside, it seems like we're in agreement there. So how about we get into the writing?
Sure. So Jeffrey Boehm wrote two early drafts of the script, and they were apparently very different from the film we got. Lorna Cole wasn't originally meant to be a woman, for instance. So the character was changed in later drafts. They were also building a relationship between Riggs and Rhiann early on, which ultimately they didn't go through with. But I think it does explain a couple of things. First, why Lorna Cole was rewritten as Riggs' love interest, and why you get a couple of scenes teasing something going on between Riggs and Rhiann that don't go anywhere. These were holdovers from the Boehm drafts.
Oh, wow. Actually, I have to wonder if Murtaugh confusing Lorna Cole with Sergeant Cole from Traffic might be a reference to her character not being a woman initially. Also, that scene where Roger saw Martin and Rianne by the car and she kissed Riggs definitely felt off to me. But with how they wrote it, I was able to excuse it away. However, now that I know that it was from the remnants of a relationship between her and Riggs in an earlier draft, it kind of grosses me out, I gotta say. That relationship would have been terribly inappropriate, and it would have, in my opinion, undermined Riggs' role of being Rianne's uncle if Roger is his brother. So I'm very glad that didn't make it in. But there was more to the writing process than that, wasn't there, Steve?
Yes, there was, but I'll add briefly that I agree with you on Riggs and Rianne. I mean, that's a clear breach of the bro code there, and that's
Yeah.
not who Riggs is. Anyway, Richard Donner also took a hand in the script, and he ended up making some changes. He was responsible for the change to Cole's character, which I think was for the better. Donner also wanted less of a story-driven script and one that focused more on Riggs and Murtaugh's friendship. He also toned down some of the action scenes, as well as bringing back Leo Getz, which I think was also a good decision. I think Joe Pesci worked really well in this film, even if he's not a huge part of the plot. After a couple of drafts and basically not liking some of Bohm's decisions, Donner fired Jeffrey Bohm and brought Kamen in. And then the studio didn't really care for what Kamen did earlier either, and then Bohm was rehired. Yeah, Hollywood. But nobody was entirely happy with those drafts, and that's probably why someone else was brought on to help with the script. And I admit I was a bit surprised by who it was until I thought a little bit about it. Before I get into detail, though, Mike, did you have any thoughts on it?
Just that apparently Carrie Fisher, yes, Princess Leia, was brought on as an uncredited script doctor on the film too. I had no idea that she was a writer at all. So I was surprised to find out that not only was she a script doctor on Lethal Weapon 3, but being a script doctor was actually something that she had done quite a bit of. Can you elaborate on that, Steve?
Absolutely. Carrie Fisher had an unsung writing career in her time. Her best known script doctor work is on Empire Strikes Back, but she had also done work on films like Sister Act, Last Action Hero, Anastasia, and The Wedding Singer. By the time that she worked on this movie, she'd already had several novels under her belt, even, including Postcards from the Edge. Incidentally, Fisher wrote a screenplay adaptation of her own novel, which became a movie starring Meryl Streep and Shirley MacLaine. But thinking about it, Fisher working on Lethal Weapon 3 actually makes a good deal of sense. Carrie Fisher always brought a very sharp wit to her writing, and the dialogue in this movie at times definitely feels that like her voice. And like she did on Empire Strikes Back, I expect Fisher probably sharpened the romantic elements as well in this film. I think it definitely shows with the relationship between Riggs and Lorna Cole. I wouldn't be surprised if Fisher had been brought on with the idea of improving the Lorna character. Carrie Fisher always wrote very strong heroines, and I think Lorna Cole is a character in that mold.
Wow. I'm actually much more impressed with Carrie Fisher now than I was before this episode. I'm a big fan of a few of those movies she has worked on, and I will say that while I don't know exactly how much she did, the romance in Lethal Weapon 3 is better than the one in Lethal Weapon 2.
Mhm.
Also, Lorna is the perfect woman for Riggs. One of the moments that really sold me on them being the perfect couple was when Riggs and Murtaugh are reinstated. Lorna makes the exact same fakes to Riggs, where she crosses just the one eye that Riggs made to the department psychiatrist Stephanie Woods during the bathroom scene in Lethal Weapon 2 from 1989. There's a bit more to why I think they're a perfect couple, but I will get into that later.
I agree that Lorna is an excellent match for Riggs, and they work really well together. But as you say, it can wait a little bit. So let's talk about the story of Lethal Weapon 3 before we do that.
Sure, Steve. A story synopsis would go like this: Martin Riggs and Roger Murtaugh, thanks to Riggs, blow up a building and get busted to patrolmen just 8 days before Murtaugh is set to retire. On their very first day walking the beat, they arrest Billy Phelps for trying to rob an armored truck, and unbeknownst to them, they just stumbled onto something huge. You see, Billy Phelps works for an ex-cop turned arms dealer, Jack Travis, who is currently using his knowledge of police procedure and policies to steal weapons from the LAPD evidence storage facilities. Then Travis is selling those weapons and armored piercing bullets to local gangs via a middleman named Tyrone. But before anyone knows what's happening, Jack Travis goes into the police station and kills Billy Phelps. Right afterwards, the captain reinstates Murtaugh and Riggs as detectives to screw over internal affairs who were trying to take over the case. What's more is that Roger shot down a friend of his son's named Daryl, who was firing at them with the very weapons weapons and bullets Jack Travis is selling. Afterwards, he basically disappears into a bottle of scotch to drown his sorrows. Riggs is on his own for a few days in the meanwhile. But Internal Affairs Officer Lorna Cole and Riggs, despite their flirtatious bickering, start working together to pursue Jack Travis. But on the way, Lorna and Riggs basically hook up, having bonded over their scar collection, mutual passion for their jobs, and that they were both martial artists. And speaking of that, I have a quick side note about Renee Russo and her character. Russo received martial arts training for a month before shooting from Cheryl Wheeler Dixon, who had a karate background and was a former kickboxing champion. And Wheeler Dixon was also her stunt double. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu instructor Rorian Gracie, who had taught Gibson and Gary Busey in the first movie in 1987, also provided training to Russo. But back to the synopsis. Riggs confronts Roger and gets him back in the game, and they go over a case of scotch. Of course, in the midst of all this, Leo Getz is trying to sell Roger's termite-infested house so that the Murtaugh family can move when Roger retires. He's also helping Riggs and Murtaugh on the case by helping them track down Travis. It all ends in a big blowout of burning houses, flying bullets, and of course, a good fight. Ultimately, Roger decides that he's not going to retire and they are not selling their house, basically screwing Leo, his real estate agent, in the process.
That sums up things pretty well, Mike. I will admit that Lethal Weapon 3 doesn't quite have the same level of energy intensity as the first two films. I think the loss of Shane Black is noticeable in that respect. There's only a couple of moments where I feel the movie starts to get serious, mainly dealing with Murtaugh having to deal with the death of Daryl, who was a friend of his son Nick's. But where the movie lacks in intensity and depth, it makes up for it by being funny and action-packed. This movie also loses any pretense of being a proper cop film because nobody acts according to proper procedure. But if you suspend disbelief and roll with it, it's a perfectly good action comedy.
That's a totally fair take, and one I think I can agree with. But I have to add this. You know, one of the things I love about doing these episodes on movies with you is that I often find that my passion for the movies we are covering increases as we go through them. And watching the Lethal Weapon franchise was no exception. I believe you said as much about your experience rewatching the franchise as well in the first episode. I mean, sure, there are things I notice viewing these films analytically that I might not care for, but the fact is that this is and always will be a beloved franchise of mine. And while, as you say, there is a definite tonal shift in Lethal Weapon 3, and I do prefer part 1 and 2 for the darker story and closer attempt at realism in police procedure, there is a place in my heart for the straight-up action comedy approach too.
Oh, likewise. I mean, I have a fondness for these films that comes from watching them in my teens, and that was before I really knew a lot about how the sausage was made. I just remember them being fun films and liking Riggs and Murtaugh together. But the writer's side of my brain does sometimes kick in now. I don't know how it is for you, but for me, if you've been writing long enough, it's easy to be critical of a lot of things. But with Lethal Weapon, I could push that to the side and enjoy it the way it's intended, and that's fine. But I think we should talk a bit about what version of the film we're talking about. Did you want to get into that?
I absolutely do, Steve. Lethal Weapon 3 is the last of the director's cut movies from the series, as the theatrical release of Lethal Weapon 4 is the director's cut. So just like I did with Lethal Weapon 1 and 2, I want to talk about the scenes that are different from the theatrical cut of Lethal Weapon 3. The USA director's cut, or unrated version, has about 3.5 minutes of never-before-seen extra footage, including the following scenes. The first scene was Roger Murtaugh opening up the safe in his closet and putting his gun in its holster. But Trish asks him if he's forgotten something, and Roger doesn't know what she's talking about. So Trish hands him his bulletproof vest and says, "This, you wear it, you sleep it, you eat in it, okay? 6 more days." Then turning to Riggs, Trish tells him to keep an eye on Roger. And just as a quick side note, I love that there was no "will you do this" or "please." That was a very family-like kind of thing to say. Just keep an eye on Roger. Just flat out like that. I like that. The next scene was when Roger had disappeared into his bottle of scotch and Rianne came by Riggs' house to tell him that about her being worried about her father. This is what inspires Riggs to go look for his partner. Also in that scene, we see McGee, the carpenter from Lethal Weapon 2, putting a veranda onto Riggs' trailer, and Riggs inside his trailer with Sam and the new Rottweiler watching the Three Stooges. The last scene was when Riggs, Murtaugh, and Cole had captured Tyrone at the auto shop. shop. While Lorna is in the driver's seat revving up the engine, the car is partially lifted up on a jack so the back tires are off the ground and spinning within inches of Tyrone's face. Meanwhile, Murtaugh is demanding a name from Tyrone about where he's getting his weapons from, and Riggs is counting down from 3 when the jack is going to fall and the tires are going to run over his head. But when Tyrone gives up the name Jack Travis, Riggs says 1 anyway, and Lorna steps on the gas. Tyrone is so scared that he passes out. Lorna drives the car forward, revealing it was never going to back over Tyrone's head.
Yeah, the Tyrone interrogation scene is exactly the kind of thing I'm talking about here. There is no way any detective is getting away with what is obviously police brutality here.
Yeah.
None of this would hold up in court if they ever managed to charge Travis for all of his various crimes. But there's another case where the comedy value and the plot expediency takes priority, and honestly, it's pretty fun to watch nonetheless. I also add that I love the scenes with Riggs watching the Stooges with Sam and the Rottweiler. Riggs has a real soft spot for dogs, and I really love that about him.
I love that about him too. I think actually that for both of us, that someone automatically gets a check in the positive column if they're a dog lover.
Yeah.
I think that was probably my favorite of the extra footage that was put in Lethal Weapon 3 as well. Also, the scene with Tyrone and several others of Riggs and Murtaugh's interactions with criminals and citizens are pretty out there, but they are a lot of fun to watch. I thought that the opening scene was well written, as are all the opening scenes, really. It naturally establishes the setting and throws us right into the plot with a funny scene. I actually still say that I will bet vital parts of my anatomy on things like Riggs did. Riggs really pushes Roger outside of his comfort zone on a regular, and this scene is a classic example of it. I like that Riggs was cracking jokes the whole time, as I often do that myself. In fact, you can probably blame Riggs, Bugs Bunny, and Spider-Man for the fact that I do that. I think my favorite was the more plastic than Cher line about the bomb. That was pretty funny. And speaking of the bomb, the roaring sound used in the explosion is the same roar done by King Kong in his self-titled 1976 film. You have to listen for it because it's covered with other sounds, but it's in there.
Oh, that was a great little cameo. Now, it turns out that the city of Orlando wanted to get rid of their old city hall, and the studio paid $175,000 to film it getting blown up. Bill Frederick, the mayor of Orlando, is the policeman who says bravo to Murtaugh and Riggs after the building explodes. The opening sequence is pretty much full-on comedy, but it's a funny scene and it works. And it also sets up Riggs and Murtaugh to be where they need to be when the action starts happening, so I can't really complain. But why don't you to get into how that plays out, Mike?
I'd be glad to. After the building explodes, Riggs and Murtaugh are busted to patrolmen, and they are arguing about which wire Riggs cut that made the bomb blow up. It plays out like Riggs forgot which wire he cut for a second, and in that scene where he cuts the wire, he does switch from the blue wire to the red wire. And actually, if you don't watch the widescreen version, even as a viewer, you don't know it was the red wire Riggs cut. I watched the full screen version for years and had no idea what wire he cut until I saw it in widescreen. And actually, there's something interesting about the scene right after Riggs and Murtaugh threatened to kill that pedestrian for a laugh. And yes, there was a little attitude in that. Riggs and Murtaugh turn into bullies when you put them together, and not casual bullies either. They're particularly cruel to Leo Getz in all of the sequels, but that rant aside. The neat thing about the scene after that is that you have Riggs on one truck fighting a robber and Murtaugh and Dolores following behind in another truck, and during that scene, Dolores refers to herself as a road warrior, which is an obvious reference to Mel Gibson's role as Mad Max. This is actually the second reference to Gibson's role as Mad Max, with the first coming in Lethal Weapon 2 from Gibson himself when he said, "We're bad, we're back, you're black, I'm mad."
I guess he couldn't get beyond Thunderdome. I agree that both Riggs and Murtaugh really treat Leo badly in this film, though. Especially Riggs, who's the one who arranges for Leo to get a rectal exam. And by the way, I'm pretty sure that would not happen in a real hospital, but let's roll with it. There's also Riggs and Murtaugh shooting the tires on Leo's car, and Leo has every right to demand that Murtaugh repay him for it. I admit that it's funny to watch, but I just can't help but feel bad for Leo. I mean, he's gone relatively straight. I mean, he's not involved in anything too openly criminal anymore. A little shady, maybe, but not the openly criminal. And he's genuinely trying to help his friends out. He doesn't deserve the abuse he gets in this movie, but he's treated as the butt of the jokes whenever he shows up, and that's a shame.
I feel bad for him too. In fact, it is safe to say that I felt worse for Leo on each consecutive view as I've gotten older. I mean, maybe, it was just a different time and it was just funnier back then. And maybe it's just that I'm a totally different person now. But it definitely hits a different note for sure.
That could be. But I also want to point out one interesting bit of casting while we're talking about the first big chase scene. Billy Phelps, the guy who drove the truck and gets plastered all over the front of the truck, he was played by Mark Pellegrino, who is best known to fans of Supernatural. In Supernatural, Pellegrino plays the human host of Lucifer, and he ends up being the main villain for a fair chunk of season 5 of Supernatural. If I didn't look at the credits, I would not have known it was him. He looked a lot different in this film than he did on that show.
I totally didn't catch that either. But to be fair, it's been years since I watched Supernatural, and I kind of started to drift away after the 5th season. So it's not really a wonder that he didn't stick out to me. But that is a very cool little fact to know. So I actually have a little rant I'd like to bounce off of you, Steve. Ranting appears to be my thing for this episode. Um, what's with Roger's holier than thou thing with Riggs, talking about we're cops, not crooks, when Riggs tries to cover up the parking meter? Throughout the franchise, they both regularly break the law when it's convenient for them. In this very movie, we find out Roger never had a permit to build over his garage. He actually acted baffled, as if the law didn't even occur to him when Leo asked him if he had a permit. And when Leo said he'd get backdated permits to fix everything, Roger had no issues with it. Roger seems to pick and choose when he wants to be moral and when he doesn't.
Yeah, I noticed that as well. Like I've been saying, much of what Riggs and Murtaugh do in this film are not proper police procedure or even close. I mean, Roger certainly turns a blind eye to a lot of the shady stuff that Riggs does and that Leo does. I will say this for Riggs, though. He at least owns to the fact that a lot of what he does is shady and he doesn't run from it or try to justify it. But Roger seems to struggle with it a lot more, and it leads to a certain level of hypocrisy.
All right. It sounds like we're on the same page there, too. Let me bounce this one off you then. When Lorna Cole says to Riggs, close is a lingerie shop without a front window. Riggs doesn't know how to react to the comment. This was actually ad-libbed by actress Renee Russo. So not only does the character not get it, actor Mel Gibson didn't get it either. and on that note, I have to put this out there for anyone listening. If you have any clue what that might mean, I would love to hear it, because I've been trying to figure that out for 30 freaking years.
Yeah, I don't have a clear answer for you on that one either. The best I can think of is that it's an intentional non sequitur designed to throw people off balance, but that's just a pure guess on my part.
Actually, that's not a bad theory. I mean, she was clearly deflecting and moving on to a more productive action. So honestly, that's better than anything I've come up with which is nothing, by the way. But let's get into some of our thoughts on the character arcs in Lethal Weapon 3. There are good and bad things about the character arcs in the film. I thought it was weird that after Lethal Weapon 2 and that world-shattering blow of the deaths of both Vicky and Rika at the hands of Vorstedt, that Riggs would basically have to rebuild himself again. I talked about that in the first episode. Granted, Riggs would be a little bit more resilient this time, having walked a similar path before, and this time he would have Roger and the Murtaughs, but there's just nothing in the film. I mean, Rika and Vicky are not even mentioned, and it feels like Lethal Weapon 2 barely happened to the Riggs character. I mean, he's up and running and even already falling in love with a new woman. I don't know about you, but if the last 2 women I was in love with died because I was a cop, I would be a lot less eager to jump into another relationship. But Riggs is not even hesitant. So I was not a big fan of that particular aspect of the story. I did, however, love the talk with Roger on the boat after Riggs found him on the dock drunk and broken because he killed Daryl. That was a great character moment for both of them. Sure, they fought and argued a bit, but I feel like they really put their cards out on the table and they were real with one another. Roger was finally the one that needed to be pulled out of the hole this time, and Riggs was there to do it for him. Plus, I really appreciated Roger's relationship with Nick growing in this one, and how Nick was able to forgive him and understand that Roger had no choice in the death of Daryl. The family came together there, and I love that. But back to the boat. As I discussed before, one of the things that got Riggs out of the hole he was in was his job and his partner, Roger. He felt like he was not alone anymore. When Roger said he was retiring, like Riggs said, he was retiring them as partners, not just for retiring from his job. Riggs, in a way, felt abandoned, and I wonder if that was at least part of why Riggs attached himself so quickly to Lorna. From a certain perspective, she could fill that role of being both a partner in the force and a lover.
That's not a bad theory. Now, I will say that that aspect bothered me too, although I was glad to finally see Riggs find a love interest that doesn't up and die on him. But yes, it's true that Riggs should have been dealing with issues after losing both and Rika, which is addressed a little bit in the fourth film, at least to be fair. I don't have a problem with Riggs not mentioning it or bringing them up necessarily, though. Riggs is the kind of person who would hold everything in. The most he does is point out to Murtaugh that he's sleeping with someone and he's not sure if it's the right thing to do. I feel like it's in character for Riggs to hold the deeper issues back, trying to tough it out. What I have a problem with, however, is that nobody else calls Riggs out on bearing his problems, including Roger and the police psychiatrist, especially Murtaugh after the big speech Riggs gives about my problems are your problems after finding him drunk on the boat. It just seemed like those points are glossed over for the purposes of this film, and that is a bit disappointing. So it's nothing that completely ruins the movie for me.
You make a good point there. I think Roger, out of everyone, should have called Riggs out for what he was going through. I mean, we flat out see him do that exact same thing to Riggs in Lethal Weapon 4 when they were on the boat at the beginning. So it's not a far stretch for that to happen here. I think it definitely should have too. Partners help keep each other in check. They're supposed to tell you things when no one else will, and admit things that they wouldn't admit to anyone else. As an example, I would say, why do you think Roger admitted to Riggs that he was wearing a girdle and not to anyone else? I hurt my back lifting weights.
Yeah, yes, that's a great example. Absolutely. They absolutely keep their worst character traits in check, and that's a sign of a really good partnership. But with all the character business out of the way, that leads us to the big action finale in the housing project. Is there anything you can tell us about how that was done?
There is. For Lethal Weapon 3's big shootout at the end, the filmmakers found an abandoned housing tract in the remote town of Lancaster, California. A victim of the savings and loan crisis, the property had been untouched for over 2 years. 12 of the 56 houses in the tract became a dramatic inferno for the scene. To meet EPA standards, the units all had to be stripped of insulation, paper, wiring, plumbing, and anything else plastic. In addition to administering a heavy dose of flame retardant to the wood, propane gas lines were installed to each of the 12 houses. This allowed for the creation of a fire that would not burn the wood and one that could be lit and relit for each take that as needed. The fire sequences were also a welcome heat source for the actors too. Night shooting in a high desert in January saw temperatures drop as low as 11 degrees.
Yeah, I can't imagine that would be comfortable at all for the people on set, and I can attest that those kinds of climates tend to get really cold at night in January. But it seems to have all worked out. The action scenes really worked though, and that was one of the good ones. I mean, I liked arranging the explosion by driving the truck full of ammo and having Murtaugh shoot the leaking gas from the tank. I mean, the fight between Riggs and Travis was generally solid for me as well. Now, I was bothered by one thing. Lerner's getting shot should have raised the specter of Riggs having lost 2 women to the bad guys, but once again, nobody brings it up, and it's swept aside. It was nice to see things go right for Riggs and Lerner in the end here, but again, somebody should have brought this up.
I felt like they were trying to talk about that a little bit with Riggs talking to Lorna as she was laying on the gurney. I mean, maybe it's just me, but that felt like Riggs holding back the fear and pain of loss you're talking about as he pleads for Lorna to make it and make it through this and to grow old with him.
Right, it's more implied than outright stated, and that's not necessarily bad, just more of a surface take than anything really deeper. And then after that, the movie just moves straight back to the chaos and mayhem of Riggs and Murtaugh. But I will admit that the way they do it is interesting. Do you have anything you wanted to say there, Mike?
Actually, I'm chaos and he's mayhem. We're a double act.
Love that line.
But seriously, I do want to talk about the final scene in the film. At the end of the credits, you can hear that another bomb has been discovered at the old hotel, and Riggs and Murtaugh drive up to it. When Murtaugh and Riggs show up in their car, they again have the discussion on whether or not they should go in. Before they can exit the car, the bomb explodes and destroys the building, and you can hear Riggs say, "I hope nobody saw us, and you better get your girdle out of mothballs because I think they're going to bust it down to patrolman again. Roger says 10 more years of this shit. They both say, I'm too old for this shit.
It's funny, but I had mixed feelings about the end credits. On the one hand, there's no question that it's hilarious, and I enjoy Riggs and Murtaugh get up to their usual shenanigans. I mean, on the other hand, bringing up another bomb threat implies that they learn absolutely nothing, and I'm not much of a fan of that. But again, I'm willing to let it go because the experience is entertaining enough despite that.
I have to say that story-wise, I totally agree with you. It fully feels like backpedaling, that once again, two homicide detectives are going to a building that's going to blow up. I mean, in the beginning, before the first building blew up, the cop asked Riggs and Murtaugh what they're even doing there. And, Riggs, of course, just says that the night is young when he says no one is dead. But when they find out that the bomb squad is on the way, Murtaugh even says that they shouldn't leave. But it was Riggs that insisted that they go in. It fully takes away from the story, but it is pretty funny, particularly the stuff that they say to each other when they're driving away.
Cool. So it seems like we're on the same page on the ending. So, how well did Lethal Weapon 3 do with audiences? I mean, it's definitely more of a crowd pleaser kind of film than the previous ones.
You're right about that. And actually, there's a little story to go along with that answer. Lethal Weapon 3 was a box office success, grossing over 320 million worldwide. It was the fifth highest grossing film of 1992 and the highest grossing installment in the series overall. Following Lethal Weapon 3's massive box office success, Warner Brothers planned to give Mel Gibson, producer Joe Silver, and producer-director Richard Donner brand new black Range Rovers as a thank you. However, Warner Brothers chairman Bob Dolly and Terry Semel only told Donner that they were invited to a celebratory lunch and the Range Rovers were kept a secret. So Donner wanted to invite Danny Glover, Joe Pesci, Rene Russo, and screenwriter Jeffrey Boehm to join them. So the studio actually scrambled all over Los Angeles trying to find these black Range Rovers and bought enough Range Rovers for all the guests that they were added to the list and presented to them happily to the stunned group after the meal was over.
Wow, that was a pretty cool thing to do. I remember Lethal Weapon 3 doing fairly well at the time, and it was a solid box office score for a third film. I mean, even if it's the weakest of the original three, it was still a satisfying experience as a whole. But did you have any favorite scenes in this one, Mike?
Oh, I do. My favorite scene in Lethal Weapon has got to be the opening scene where Riggs cut the wrong wire and the bomb blew up. My favorite part is actually when it's all over and Riggs is patting Roger on the shoulder, and Roger is so irritated with him that he grabs his hand and tosses it away. Yeah, oops. But seeing Lorna kick all those guys' ass in the auto shop was pretty cool too. I really like the scene where Riggs makes friends with the dogs, and for that matter, I expect my DM to get that reference when I make it in the game. But alas, I make references all the time that people don't get, so you'd think I'd be used to it.
Yeah, I enjoyed both of those, and anything with the Rottweiler was pretty good. I mean,
Yeah.
I also like the scene where the Riggs and Cole are exchanging war wounds and what amounts to foreplay. Apparently, it was a riff on a similar scene from Jaws, but except a lot steamier in practice.
Ah.
Oh yeah, and I enjoyed the fact that when the bomb blows up, the only thing anyone thinks to do is save the cat from the building. But I think that covers everything from this movie. So why don't we talk about Lethal Weapon 4?
I can actually see grab the cat just being an ongoing lingo they use for we need to get the hell out of here. But anyway, that sounds like a good idea, Steve. Lethal Weapon 4 came out in 1998, and it was again produced and directed by Richard Donner and produced by Joe Silver. Silver Pictures was again used, but they were not the only production company this time. Doshudo Productions out of New York was involved this time. I've mentioned several of the recurring characters in the franchise, but they have all been people. But being a dog lover as I am, I have to point out that Riggs' dog Sam is in every movie. But I have to comment on something. Riggs says to the Rottweiler, who, by the way, neither Riggs nor Lorna ever name in the two movies, and to Sam that there is no favorites between them. Sam saved his life in Lethal Weapon 2 by warning him that people were coming, and he was also his only companion while he was deep in the hole of depression. Sam had been there for him through a lot, and if I were Riggs in that scenario, they would absolutely be a favorite. I'm not saying that I would give one a treat and not the other, but emotionally I would be way more attached to Sam.
I'm a dog lover myself, so I can totally sympathize with that reaction. I think I probably would as well. As much as you might love your other pets, it always hits different when you have that shared experience with a particular dog. But please go on.
Sure. Let's talk about the rest of the cast. Paul Twerp appears in all four Lethal Weapon movies, but always in a slightly different role. He played a mercenary in the first film, a hitman in the second film, a henchman number three in the third film, and a helicopter pilot in the fourth. I actually had no idea that about that until I was researching for this episode, but I'm totally going to start watching for him now. Kim Chan makes his first appearance in the franchise as Uncle Benny. Jackie Chan was originally considered for the role of Wasing Ku, but turned it down because he doesn't play villains. Jet Li had never played a villain before, but he took the role and it was his first American production, though he had shot movies in America before. Al Leong, who played the mercenary Endo in the Lethal Weapon film from 1987, appeared in it as in an uncredited role as a triad member.
Cool. So I have a few things to add here. Paul Twerpe is someone who goes back a long way with Richard Donner, and that's probably why he keeps coming back. He was Sergeant Haley in Superman the movie, and he's been in many other Donner films, including The Goonies, Lady Hawk, and Conspiracy Theory. He seems to be an old reliable for Donner who can do a lot of small roles and do a lot of consistent work. As for Jet Li, the man is a legend. I mean, one might even say the fist of legend. But he's an outstanding martial artist, and if that was the only thing he would good at, he'd still be one of the best things in this film. But Lee's also an amazing actor in this movie, and he gets both the cold-bloodedness of Wasinku and the more sympathetic side of him. He's probably the best villain we've seen in these films in a while.
We are 100% agreed. But I will elaborate on my thoughts about Jet Li in more detail later on. Now, before we transition into the writing, I have a little cross section segue into it with the casting. So Leo Getz and Lee Butters were not in the original scripts. I'm not sure why, as they are great characters in this movie. Perhaps Steve can shed some light on that when he gets to the writing. But when Joe Pesci was hired, Gibson had to write him into the script. And then when he was right about three-fourths of the way through the new draft, Chris Rock was hired, which forced him to rewrite the script yet again. But that was not the end. Butters was originally written to be a gay detective at the LAPD. But as soon as they started filming the scene at the police station between Butters, Riggs, and Murtaugh, everyone felt like his character was just not working. So there was yet another rewrite to make him Rianne's husband instead. But they did not change much, I think. There's still an ongoing joke in the movie about how Murtaugh is afraid Butters is gay, and I can't help but think that this is the lingering part from the former draft. Plus, you'll notice that despite being married, Butters and Rianne only share one scene in the film and never say anything to each other but a couple of knowing nods, and that was due to last-minute changes on made to his character. But that is my segue into talking about the writing process, which is my friend Steve's territory. So, can you explain what a nightmare working on the script must have been like?
Nightmare is a good word for what happened here. This movie went through constant revisions and rewrites, and they started putting the movie into production before they even had a finished script. So already you're looking at problems, and I'm amazed this film is as good as it is, given all the rewrites and script issues. The process started when Joel Silver tried to buy a screenplay called Simon Says, which dealt with a detective dealing with a mad bomber who planted bombs all over the city. They wanted to use this idea for Lethal Weapon 4, but Silver lost out on the bidding, and the script went to 20th Century Fox, and they used it for one of the Die Hard sequels. Then they brought in Jonathan Lemkin, who had done some script doctor work and was best known for Demolition Man. Then Jeffrey Brohm was brought back in to do Lethal Weapon 4, and he had the idea of having Riggs and Murtaugh go up against a group of neo-Nazi terrorists. Bohm reportedly wrote several drafts, and he wasn't satisfied with any of them. But he wasn't the only one involved. Different writers had their own competing script drafts and ideas of what they wanted the film to be. But Warner Brothers rejected all of them, and the only idea the studio liked was the idea of Chinese triads, which is ultimately what they went with. But a number of people disagreed with the studio and preferred Bohm's idea. Bohm wanted to veer back more in the direction of the first two films, and he felt the counterfeit currency idea just wasn't interesting or impactful enough to be a good Lethal Weapon film. Now, there were people behind the scenes that preferred Bohm's ideas, but they were overruled by the studio. Jonathan Lemkin then came back in 4 years after his original script was rejected with the idea of pulling off the triad idea that WB wanted. But again, there were competing scripts by other writers. So you had Miles Miller and Alfred Goo, who were known for shows like Smallville and the most recent Wednesday, and they did their own script. Presumably, some elements of that version made it in the final draft because they were officially credited for it. Joel Silver then brought in a TV writer named Channing Gibson, who had worked on shows like NYPD Blue. Gibson originally took the job because he thought it would be light work compared to his TV work. However, it turned out to be much harder than his TV projects because of the numerous rewrites that were required of him. Because of that, the script was only halfway finished by the time the movie entered production, and they had no idea what the ending even was until they filmed it. Uh, so there are definitely elements of a Frankenstein draft with this script, and man, does it show. So let me elaborate on some points that you brought up earlier. As you mentioned, Leo Getz wasn't even in the script initially, but then Joe Pesci was paid $1 million for 3 weeks of work, so they had to write him in. The film reflects that honestly. I got the impression that when Riggs and Murtaugh think to hire Leo to tail Unreal Benny, this was the writers talking as much as the characters, as if Channing Gibson and Richard Donner had only just figured out what to do with Leo. And then Leo is amazingly left alone by people who have no problem invading Murtaugh's house, holding his entire family hostage, and burning his house down. That does not sound like something that would happen to Leo if this was part of the plan the whole time. On a plot level, Leo is barely a factor, but he makes up for that both with the comedy and a very good character scene at the end of the film. You also mentioned that Butters was envisioned as a gay detective, but then that was rewritten. So that's why you get the misunderstanding drama with Butters and Murtaugh. As you said, it's a holdover from the previous draft. This was probably also driven by your point that Chris Rock was brought in with only three-fourths of Gibson's draft on the script done. Also, as an aside, Chris Rock beat out several other actors for this role, including Will Smith, who later slapped him at the 2022 Oscars. You can't make this stuff up. Anyway, the unfinished writing shows in the film because I get the impression that some of Rock's character in this movie was at least partially ad-libbed by Rock. The interactions with Butters and Leo are some of my favorite parts of the film, but I think it's because Rock and Pesci's performances and their additions are really good, and not because they were originally written that way. Anyway, there just were too many cooks in the broth, too much meddling by the studio, and the result is a Frankenstein script that holds up better than it really has any right to. Is there anything else you want to add on the production side, Mike?
I do, but first I have to say that sounds like a horrible experience. I don't know that I would want to work in film with that kind of stuff going on as much as it does. It takes a certain kind of resilience and a fair amount of quick thinking to work in that environment. And as much as I love movies and TV, I'm really glad I write comics. But to your question, Lethal Weapon 4 went into production in early January 1998, and with an already planned July release in that same year. However, due to its issues during filming, including script changes, production ended around mid-May. Editors had to work very quickly to have the film ready, which is why the trailers for Lethal Weapon 4 show some deleted and alternate scenes which are not in the film. But despite this, the film was finished and released as planned.
That also makes sense. It may be that another reason why this movie isn't a complete disaster is because Richard Donner saved it in the editing process. As we've talked about in the earlier films, Donner has a very keen sense of how story beats work in a movie, and he knows what scenes are needed. So he may have filmed a lot of footage and then took the bits and pieces that worked the best and made it all connect. Donner may very well have saved the film if that's the case.
That certainly sounds like a very real possibility. Editors are often the saviors in these situations. And as you say, Donner has a real eye for that kind of stuff. But let's get into the story we ended up with. So, with the exception of the real time between Lethal Weapon 1 and 2, there are some gaps between the films that audiences have to piece together from what's going on in the new film. So, I wanted to point out what changes that occurred between Lethal Weapon 3 and Lethal Weapon 4, as there is a 6-year gap to fill in there, and a lot of stuff goes down. Lorna apparently survived her wounds from the third movie and has no ill effects. In fact, she's pregnant. Riggs has moved his trailer yet again. Murtaugh's wife, Trish, starts writing cheesy sex novels under the pseudonym Ebony Clark and is apparently quite good at it, as sales from her books are bringing in quite a bit of money for the Murtaugh family. But Roger has decided to keep this a secret from his friends and co-workers and even some family, including Riggs. Consequently, people talk, and before long, Internal Affairs gets a tip that Roger is on the take and launches an investigation. Also, Leo has abandoned his real estate career to pursue a career as a private investigator. But there is more than one secret in the Murtaugh family. Roger's daughter, Rianne, dated, got pregnant with, and then married Detective Lee Butters. And knowing her father would never accept that she married a cop, she kept it from Roger. However, Trish knows, and so does Lorna. At some point, some unspecified point during all of this, the head guys in the Chinese triad, known as the Four Fathers, are brought back to America via Uncle Benny. In order to buy them back, triad criminal Wasing Ku plans to make counterfeit money to pay the bill to the corrupted general who holds them. He even brings in Chinese slaves via Uncle Benny to increase production. And that is about where Lethal Weapon 4 begins.
When Rick started looking at the Ebony Clark romance novel, I was honestly thinking the author was one of the Murtaughs. I didn't think it was Raj because he's just too stiff and straight laced for that kind of thing. I was thinking it was probably either Trish or Rianne, but it being Trish makes sense given the extra money and the fact that Trish probably had a lot of time on her hands to write books. Now, I can totally understand why Roger wouldn't tell Riggs. He probably thought Riggs would end up trolling him about it for the rest of his days, which he totally would, let's be honest. But I don't think Riggs would honestly do that to Trish. He has a much more open and serious friendship with her, and usually is extremely nice to Murtaugh's family, as much grief as he gives Raj.
I actually have a theory about that for you, Steve. Roger could not afford the Murtaugh's house and multiple cars in every film if there was not more than one income coming into the Murtaugh house. My guess is that if police sergeants were making that kind of money, Riggs would be living better than he does. Put simply, I think Trish has been writing all along, and perhaps a recent book like the one Lorna was reading happened to really hit big, and maybe that even brought in more sales of her old books. Either way, I think the financial windfall was that rather than her just writing one book that took off.
That sounds like a reasonable theory to me. My original assumption was that Raj got some really good money off the insurance and or a settlement after the boat was destroyed. But I really like the idea that Trish was building herself up as a writer in the previous films, and nobody ever really knew about it. It also makes Trish more of an interesting character and gives her more of a life beyond taking care of her family.
I like that a lot more too. I feel like it really helps to round out the Murtaugh family. But let me do a story synopsis for the film before we go too much farther. Well, I changed a little. This synopsis is in large part from IMDb. Roger Murtaugh and Martin Riggs are feeling too old to be cops anymore, and with kids on the way, they are rethinking their priorities. Here's an interesting tidbit. Mel Gibson was 40 years old when Lethal Weapon 4 was filmed, the same age Danny Glover was in when the first film was made. But Danny Glover was 51, a year older than his character Murtaugh was in the first film. Despite their actual ages, though, the "we're not too old for this" rings true, as Riggs is now approaching the age Murtaugh was when they first met. But back to the synopsis. With the kids on the way any day now, Roger, Martin, and Leo are out on Murtaugh's boat, the Code 7, which, interestingly enough, is the LAPD radio code for a lunch break. Anyway, they are fishing Los Angeles harbor when they are sideswiped by a huge freighter. After a wild gunfight against a group of Chinese men who were on the freighter, it is discovered that the freighter is full of illegal Chinese immigrants. As Murtaugh sulks over what is left of his now sunken yacht, he discovers a hidden Chinese immigrant family and their patriarch, Mr. Hong, and decides to take them in. At the police station, Detective Nig expresses his belief that Chinatown crime boss Uncle Benny is behind the smuggling, and he is right. Uncle Benny has imported Chinese slaves to pay for an artist, Mr. Hong's uncle, to create counterfeit Chinese currency, which the triad will use to buy the Four Fathers back from the Chinese military. Sergeant Lorna Cole in the Internal Affairs Division is unable to help out on the case because she is pregnant with Riggs' baby, and Murtaugh's daughter Rianne is also pregnant. Helping Riggs, Murtaugh, and Leo on the case is Sergeant Lee Butters, the father of Rianne's baby. Wasing Ku, a leader of the Chinese triads, is angry about the disappearance of the Hong's family and the family Murtaugh took in. And Wasing Ku and his men show up at the Murtaugh house, take the Hongs, and set the house on fire, with Riggs, Lorna, Murtaugh, Rianne, Murtaugh's wife Trish, Murtaugh's other daughter Carrie, and his son Nick inside. Unknown to Wasing Ku, little Ping, the youngest member of the Hong family, was left behind in the house. Ping frees Riggs, who frees the others. Later, when Riggs, Murtaugh, Butters, and Lauren to discover that Wasing Ku has killed Mr. Hong, Mr. Hong's uncle, and Uncle Benny Chan. Roger takes it very personally that Hong and Hong's uncle were killed. The whole thing culminates into a giant shootout when Riggs and Murtaugh reveal to the corrupt general that the money Wasing Ku is using to pay him with is fake. During the shootout, Wasing Ku's brother, one of the four fathers, is killed by Roger, and both he and Riggs end up in quite the battle with the dangerous and now furious Wasing Ku. That fight is actually the only fight in the franchise where Murtaugh is in the final fight too, and not just Riggs.
I actually like that angle of it. Riggs has lost a few steps by his own admission, and Murtaugh isn't equipped to handle a master martial artist alone. But I appreciated the idea that Riggs and Murtaugh had to defeat him together because they couldn't do it alone. I think that's a great statement on how Riggs and Murtaugh have grown as friends and as partners. It's also a statement of how much Riggs has grown to rely on Roger rather than face his demons alone, and how Murtaugh has learned to trust Riggs completely in turn. They wouldn't have been able to pull that off in the first film. Not at all. It's the strength of their friendship and their partnership, their brotherhood even, that allows them to win when they might have failed alone. And all of that is earned because their trials in the last four films and how they've grown together because of what they faced as a team. That was the right ending, I think.
100%. The perfect final fight to cap off the series. You hit all of the really big points, so I don't have too much to add there, but I do love the relationship between Riggs and Murtaugh in that ending, especially with Roger saving Riggs at the end. It really worked as a great partner character arc. But there are some other things I want to talk about from the film. At the beginning of the film, when Riggs shoots the man with the flamethrower, sending him flying into the gas station, a muffled Wilhelm scream can be heard. If you're wondering what a Wilhelm scream is, I can tell you that you've heard it dozens of times. It's a stock sound effect that has been used in countless films since 1951's Distant Drums. The scream is usually used when someone is shot, falls from a great height, or is thrown from an explosion. The sound is named after Private Wilhelm, a character from The Charge at Feather Falls in 1953 Western, in which the character gets shot in the thigh with an arrow. And now that you know that, you have the same curse that I do, and that will not be able to not notice that scream whenever it is used. You're welcome.
Now I'm curious about that Western. Even if it sounds like the old Skyrim meme about taking an arrow to the knee. but if I'm honest about the cold open, it seems like almost like they're throwing Riggs and Murtaugh against a full-on supervillain in this scene. This dude is wearing full covered bulletproof armor, which is practically a super suit. He uses a gimmick with a flamethrower, and he's just interested in causing mayhem and destruction like a supervillain would. To be honest, if I used a villain like this in an issue of Blitz, it wouldn't feel out of place at all. But in a buddy cop film, it does seem a little bit weird and over the top, even if it works for comedy. Maybe it's Donner's Superman root showing. I don't know. But speaking of comedy, I think you had something you wanted to add about it with this scene, Mike.
I do actually. In that same opening scene, Murtaugh strips down to his underwear to create a diversion, or in reality, because Riggs wanted to see if he would do it. The scene was actually a comedic play on the scene from 1991's Ricochet, starring Denzel Washington. In that movie, Denzel's character is also a cop, and he happens to be outside at night shooting at a bad guy. He too strips down to his underwear, but Denzel's character did it to gain the criminal's trust and then shoot him with his backup gun that was tucked between his spine and his Fruit of the Loom tag. In Lethal Weapon, it was intended as a distraction rather than a deception. But the point remains, I think. Director Richard Donner was watching old cop movies from the early 90s looking for inspiration for Lethal Weapon 4. Apparently, Donner came across Denzel's work and thought it would be an entertaining way to put a funny twist on the same sequence, and knew that it would fit perfectly with the characters and story he had to work with.
Now that is interesting. I have noticed that occasionally Donner will riff on certain films here and there as it makes sense. And we saw that with the war wound scene in the third film, for example. The chicken thing was funny though, and it does look like the practical joke that Riggs would pull on Roger. What's even better is that Riggs trolls him constantly about this by putting copies of the news clipping of Roger in his underwear all over the station.
Well, you knock it off, people. I mean, the man has feelings, for God's sake. The initial joke was really only moderately funny, but Riggs and the others trolling Roger about it through the whole film was really the best part. Those scenes make me laugh every time. I also want to talk about a character that might be my favorite villain in the franchise, Wasing Ku, played by the great Jet Li. I just want to say that Jet Li is my favorite martial artist now. but I initially saw him in Lethal Weapon 4 for the first time, and I was blown away. I had not seen him before because I didn't follow Hong Kong martial arts movies. But what really amazed me about Jet Li was his lightning fast speed and awesome flexibility. When Riggs is fighting Wasing Ku, Wah uses a scorpion kick to knock him down. 1 year later, this would become the signature martial arts move of Trinity in The Matrix from 1999. The Trinity actress Carrie-Anne Moss did not have the flexibility and strength to do the scorpion kick, so they used a fake leg. As seen in the movie, clearly Jet Li is capable of doing that for real. That's mad flexibility, folks. His light speed movements and that clearly demonstrated flexibility combined to make real power in martial arts. Those are things I also admire about the legendary Bruce Lee. And much like directors had to do with the great Bruce Lee, Richard Donner also had to ask the great Jet Li to slow down as he was moving so fast that the camera was not able to capture his movements. And let's talk about Jet Li's display of speed in Lethal Weapon for a second, and with his pulling off the slide of Riggs' gun. To get the slide off of a Beretta 92 FS, the weapon Riggs had, you have to push in a button on the right side to unblock a lever on the left side. The lever then has to be rotated 90 degrees in order to release the slide. It is possible to grab the gun, push the tab down, rotate the lever, and pull the slide to disarm the weapon quickly, especially when the button has already been pushed down and the lever partly rotated like it was when Wasing Ku pulls the slide off a Riggs gun. You know, Gibson's character Riggs mockingly calls Wasing Ku Bruce in reference to Bruce Lee. Ironically, while Jet Li had tried to distance himself from the legendary actor and martial artist Bruce Lee, Jet had recently made a remake of Lee's Fists of Fury from 1972 with Fist of Legend in 1994. Jet Li's outfit as Wasing Ku even resembles both the outfits Bruce Lee wears in Fist of Fury. And one last side note, according to behind-the-scenes footage, Rene Russo was very scared of being hit for real during the filming of the scene where Wasing Ku knocks Lorna out with a single kick to the head. So much so that she refused to open the door for a few moments when the camera started rolling.
Oh man, Jet Li is indeed one of the greats, and he's so good in this movie. So I completely believe that Jet Li dominating everyone with martial arts is probably down to his own skill and not even necessarily the fight choreography. He's extremely fast, extremely flexible, extremely skilled, and that makes him such a credible opponent in this movie.
For certain, the next thing I'd like to bring up is that in Lethal Weapon 3 from 1992, Captain Murphy told Riggs to get a haircut, and he says, "Of course I won't." In Lethal Weapon 4, he appears to have gotten a haircut, so I guess he will. For that matter, in Lethal Weapon 2, the captain points out that there's a sign in his office that says no smoking. And Riggs says he knows and points out that there's another sign on the door that says that too, but he doesn't give a fuck. But you'll notice he starts trying to quit smoking by the end of 2 and through 3 and finally quits altogether by 4. Roger complained about it more than once, and it did not affect Riggs. In fact, he offered to put it out once. Remember in the first film, and he ended up changing his mind and said, "Well, how about if I roll down the window? How about that instead?" But I think that the captain saying something to him had more of an effect on Riggs than he was willing to let on.
Riggs has grown up a lot by the time we get to this movie. He's gotten older and a bit slower, and now he has a family and people to lose. There's also something about being a father that changes you, and I think that's part of why Riggs gives up smoking. He doesn't care if he's just living it for himself, but he isn't doing that anymore. He has Lorna and now their son to think of now, so he can't be the risk taker he used to be, and he can't indulge in self-destructive bad habits like he did before. By the end, I think Riggs starts to see Murtaugh's side of things, even if he has a little bit of his old wild streak left in him. So, did you want to get that a little bit more, Mike?
I totally do. I feel like we finally come full circle with the characters in Lethal Weapon 4. Riggs has now reached a level of understanding about Murtaugh that he didn't have before because he is now the same age as Roger was when they first met. Suddenly, he is seeing things from a different perspective, and I think he is realizing his limitations, something Roger has been saying all along. Of course, Roger being 12 years older than Riggs, he finally says, "Oh my gosh, finally!" Right? I also like that things finally got on better ground between Murtaugh, Riggs, and Getz. I mentioned before about them being bullies to Getz for a few movies, so it was really cool, in my opinion, that there was a redemption arc and a change in Riggs after that cemetery scene with Leo. You know, they, including Leo, called themselves family before, but I feel like it was not until Leo and Riggs had that moment that he really was accepted as one of them, and Riggs felt remorse over how he and Roger had been treating Leo. Also, Riggs finally becomes whole again and remarries and starts his own family. The healing is complete at that point. But that's not the only thing. Trish comes into her own as a writer, and Rianne grows up and starts a family of her own. These were more subtle, but made for nice arcs for the characters.
Yeah, agreed with all that. I like that Leo is finally accepted into the found family by the end, even if Riggs and Murtaugh like to mess with him constantly. To be honest, when it comes to Riggs and his pranking, I think he most tends to target either people he really likes deep down or people that he hates, which is mainly the bad guys. Leo probably does annoy Riggs enough to prank him, but I think he's kind of an annoying brother kind of thing at that point. It's no accident that Riggs's most frequent targets are usually Leo or Roger, and we know that Raj is the one person Riggs will go to the ends of the earth for. And really, there's no way that Raj would invite Leo onto his boat for a trip if Murtaugh didn't think of him as a good friend. So yeah, Riggs and Murtaugh may torment Leo constantly, but deep down they accept him as part of the family, even if he can be a pain at times.
There's actually something to be said about that. As a general rule, with very few exceptions, if I never pick on you at all, I probably don't like you. So I can certainly see that in Riggs. But I have to change the subject to something a bit darker that I could not help but notice this time through the films. You know, homophobia seems to be a running gag in the Lethal Weapon franchise. In the first Lethal Weapon movie, Riggs says that Amanda Hunsaker and Dixie having sex is disgusting. And Riggs asks Murtaugh if he's a fag when Murtaugh tries to put out the fire on his jacket when Dixie's house explodes. In part two, there was a joke about Leo coming in and seeing Riggs' head down by the toilet where what Roger was stuck on. There's a similar awkward moment in Lethal Weapon 3 when it looked like Riggs and Murtaugh were holding each other in the kitchen. Again, they got a dirty look from Leo. Or in that same movie where Roger is on his knees holding the flowers from Dolores in front of Riggs, and Dr. Woods suggests that they need to come speak with her. I imagine there could be more to it than that, like it would not be a good idea for partners to date, but still it seems like the homosexual nature of the appearance was part of the joke there. Then in Lethal Weapon 4, Roger gets worried that Butters might be gay and starts acting paranoid about everything Butters says and does and won't even let Butters walk behind him. Riggs, in reference to one of Bruce Lee's films, mockingly says, "Enter the drag queen," when talking to Wasing Koo. It's not right out there screaming at you all the time, but the fact that some type of joke about homophobia had to be made in each film really jumped out of me this time. It was different. It was a different world when the movies came out. I just didn't notice this stuff back then. It's kind of like the bullying seemed normal to me at the time too, as that kind of behavior was more common. I'm not trying to soapbox here. It's just something I can see now that I couldn't before.
Yeah, same here. I agree that some of the jokes in this movie have not aged well at all, and they can get really insensitive by modern standards. But it's not just the homophobic jokes. I mean, there are also some really culturally and racially insensitive jokes towards Asian people in this movie as well. The whole fried rice scene with Riggs and Uncle Benny especially doesn't look good by today's standards. I mean, people probably not thought nothing of those things at the time, but looking at it now, I just can't help but wince whenever I run across them.
Oh yeah, there are Asian slurs all over this film, and really, that's kind of weird and a little different for Lethal Weapon. I mean, I mean that in the sense that when Lethal Weapon has tackled other social or political issues in the past, they did not simultaneously spend the whole film making fun of the thing they were bringing attention to. And yet, in this film, we got attention to Chinese slavery in America, and even a family to directly sympathize with. But still.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, the true human trafficking element is a serious issue, and that's not an easy issue to talk about in a sensitive way, especially when you're talking about comedy. Though there were some good bits here and there. I will say that I like that Riggs and Lorna had semi-adopted Ping, the little boy that came with the Hongs. It especially works when you consider that they're about to become first-time parents. But as a whole, I agree about the problematic nature of the comedy here, so I think we can move on to more positive points.
That's a great idea, Steve. Let's talk about our favorite parts of the film. My favorite parts of the movie really all involve the hilarious Chris Rock. I loved his "We will provide you with the dumbest fucking lawyer on earth" line. Also, that scene with Butters and Getz talking about the phones, da 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 4, da 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 5.
Yeah, Butters and Gets are really good. I love their first meeting when they start roasting each other. Again, I wouldn't be surprised if at least some of that was ad libbed. I mean, those moments are two really funny actors playing off each other, and they're getting some good zingers in. I need to comment as well on the scene between Riggs and Stephanie Woods. So Riggs is genuinely trying to get her advice for once because he's trying to decide if marriage is the right thing for him right now. But because Riggs has pranked her so many times, Woods just gets angry at him, thinking that he's just trying to mess with her again. And then after Woods just completely loses it, Riggs just lets her think it really was a prank the whole time. She's really not a very good psychologist, is she? I also enjoyed the scene where Riggs, Murtaugh, and Butters go into the dentist's office to interrogate Uncle Benny, and they all inhale laughing gas. Somebody who's been in the dentist and I've had laughing gas, I can tell you that that's funny. So while I think that this movie probably is the weakest of the four films, there are still good enough moments that it holds up okay.
I think I have to disagree with you about Lethal Weapon 4 being the weakest in the franchise. But I also have to admit that at least 30% of that position is based just on Jet Li. Another part of it is that I too am getting old. But as I mentioned, I really liked the character arc, and I felt like it was a great way to close out the franchise. For me, I would rank them 1, 2, 4, 3. But I believe there was actually a Lethal Weapon video game, wasn't there, Steve?
That's completely a fair take, but yes, there was a Lethal Weapon video game, though the series ultimately did not take off in that format. It was made as a tie-in to Lethal Weapon 3, which released around the same time. The game was developed by Ocean Software and Eurocom, and it was released in 1992 or in 1993, somewhere around there. There were two different versions of this game. One was a beat 'em up side scroller that was released for the NES and the original Game Boy. It was a pretty generic brawler game, and though you could play as Riggs and Murtaugh, the two characters were pretty much interchangeable in practice. The version I am familiar with and one I've actually played is the Lethal Weapon game that came out for the Super Nintendo. This version is more of a platformer game, and it's annoyingly difficult. It plays quite a bit like the original Ninja Turtles game, if you can believe that. You get to play which character you want, Riggs or Murtaugh. Though I imagine most people probably would play Riggs just because he's such a cool character. You get a limited number of lives, and then you switch to the other character that you didn't pick when he dies, and then he has a limited number of lives to get through the level. In practice, there's a lot of jumping around, bad guys running around, and you have to avoid them or kill them when you get to the next stage. And that's often not very easy because the bad guys are quick, and you have a limited number of shots with your pistol. On top of that, and this is what I really object to, you take fall damage if you fall from a height. This can really be a problem if you're knocked off the rails by an unexpected hit from a bad guy. And some of those bad guys will drop bombs on you, and you typically will not be able to see it coming. So after taking the hit from the bomb, you have to start getting back all over again to where you left off. And on top of that, you take damage from the fall. It's nonsense. I will say that I like one thing about it. I remember that every time I died in that game, you hear Danny Glover saying his line, "I'm too old for this." So as frustrating as that game could be, I got a good laugh out of it when I was done with it. But neither version of Lethal Weapon is a particularly good game, and there have actually been videos on YouTube dissecting it. But it was the 16-bit era, and licensed action games back then were pretty limited. I'm a bit surprised that WB hasn't tried to make a video game based on Lethal Weapon since then, though. If they were to do it right, you could get a really cool action game. And there's no better time than now to do it. I mean, WB does have an in-house gaming division, so there's no reason why they can't put out a new Lethal Weapon game if they really wanted to.
I have to say those games sound horrible to me. I mean, they took a generic game like setup and applied characters and abilities that don't belong to it. I mean, there should be no jumping around and fighting like Ninja Turtles in the game. I'm actually kind of glad I missed that, even if I would get a kick out of Roger saying I'm too old for this when I died. So, as some of you may already know, there's a Lethal Weapon 5 movie coming out. So we decided to dig out what we could find out about it. Apparently, talks about a fifth film go back as far as 2007, but in 2008, Donner told the Los Angeles Times that Lethal Weapon 5 was dead in the water, despite him and Lethal Weapon 4 co-creator Channing Gibson having an incredibly strong story for the fifth movie. But in 2011, Warner Brothers planned to reboot the Lethal Weapon franchise with a brand new cast, which eventually led to the short-lived TV show. Mel Gibson turned down a previous script written by Shane Black and Chuck Mundry that was set to be directed by Shane Black. Richard Donner speculated that he turned it down because the reboot didn't involve Gibson. It wasn't until 2017 that the idea of a fifth film seemed possible again, with Gibson, Glover, and Donner all down to return if Warner Brothers would greenlight it. Richard Donner sadly passed away during pre-production in 2021 at the age of 91. But back in 2018, Donner revealed that the title for the fifth film would be Lethal Finale. Lethal Weapon 5 will be the only film in the franchise not to be directed by Richard Donner. However, due to his years, he had personally asked his friend Mel Gibson to take over in such an event. After his death, Mel Gibson announced that he would direct as his friend had requested. In the latter part of 2021, Gibson confirmed that Lethal Weapon 5 will be exclusively on HBO Max and that the script has been written by the Equalizer's Richard Wenk, and Gibson is hoping to start shooting in 2023. And talk about being too old for this shit. If that's true, Danny Glover will be 76 and Mel Gibson will be 67.
That is too old for this shit. I didn't know about this myself until fairly recently, but I will say I'm intrigued by it. Though I'm of two minds on this subject. I mean, on the one hand, Glover and Gibson may really be too old for this, but there are some counterparts of this that do intrigue me. One is that the story has the fingerprints of Richard Donner on this, and Mel Gibson certainly can direct. Braveheart coming most obviously to mind here. And it's only a Lethal Weapon story with Mel Gibson and Danny Glover attached, which they are. If this is being done as a tribute to Richard Donner, which it sounds like it is, then maybe we're seeing. But I guess we'll see what happens when it's finally out.
Yes, we will, and I honestly can't wait to see it. But that about wraps up our 36th anniversary episode for Lethal Weapon. Thanks for listening. We'll see you again in 2 weeks. But before we go, I'd like to thank our patrons who make this podcast possible.